Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. We're very excited to share with you our primary market research data about consumer and physician attitudes about the changing landscape of obesity in America. I'm Scott Morano. I'm a Senior Vice President with Ipsos, and I'm focused on pharmaceutical market research. And I'd like to introduce my colleague, Roberto.
Thank you, Scott. Hi, my name is Roberto Cortese, and I'm a Senior Director at Ipsos, and I'm based in London. I'm part of our Global Healthcare Monitors team, and in particular, my role is to lead our studies in obesity and cardiometabolic disease, which I will talk about more later.
Thanks, Roberto. So what we're going to cover today are really three main topics. The first topic is consumer attitudes and interests in anti-obesity medications, or AOMs, physician attitudes towards AOMs, and what we believe are the near-term implications in the AOM market based on the research that we've conducted. So I'd like to start by setting the stage with some groundwork. I know you might have heard this in Oliver's presentation, but obesity and being overweight is something that impacts a majority of Americans. 74% of Americans are either overweight or obese, with 43% of Americans falling in that obese category, which is defined as a BMI greater than 30. This data is coming from the NHANES data released by the federal government a few years back with a sample size of 5,000. This is really the gold standard for understanding the prevalence of being overweight and obese in America. So it is something that is really impacting our entire society. I know Oliver might have covered some of the conditions that obesity is often a precursor towards, but obesity itself can lead to other comorbidities such as depression, sleep apnea, COPD, cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and cancer. So really, it is a health situation and a health crisis that leads to so many other conditions that can impact people over the course of their lives. And as far as how Americans and people are reacting to their weight and their challenges with weight, from some recent data that Ipsos collected, 41% of Americans right now have reported adjusting their diet and or their exercise to lose weight specifically within the past 3 months. This is data that we collected, and you'll see this throughout our presentations. We collect primary market research. In this case, this was a sample of 1,000 adults that we collected the data in late July. The study is randomly drawn from our online panel and from different partner sources, and it's not relying on a population frame in a traditional sense. We're using this panel and we calibrate the results based on the representative US population. So it is all balanced to census targets. So you can trust that this data of 1,000 adults is representative of all age ranges, socioeconomic factors, race, ethnicity, and gender. All right, and with that, we will double click into consumer interest in AOMs. What we find, and we found this consistently over the past year, is that Americans believe obesity is a very serious public health issue. When we ask people, what is the #1 threat to American public health? Obesity is consistently ranked as the #2 threat to public health, only behind opioids and fentanyl. And it's ranked as a more serious public issue than mental health, access to guns, cancer, or climate change. And we've seen this really consistently over the past year or so. We also find that with talk of AOMs really percolating in the news and in public sentiment, people generally speaking are very opposed to the perceived use of these kinds of medications for folks who are not obese or diabetic. So 64% of Americans somewhat or strongly oppose the use of weight loss medications by those who aren't obese and diabetic. And this relates, primarily to celebrities or influencers who might have experienced recent weight loss or have talked about using Ozempic or other kinds of medications. And the public really disapproves of that, especially in light of seeing it as a public health threat. That said, 54% of Americans are very or somewhat interested in a weight loss medication. So there really is an interest by a majority of Americans in a medication to help them lose weight. Now, it's interesting to note that while 54% are interested in a weight loss medication, that still is less than the percent of Americans that are overweight or obese. So it's not something that's um, looked at by everybody who would be eligible to sees this as something that they themselves would be interested in. When we look at the folks who are most interested in weight loss medication, there are some subgroups that are more interested than others. We find in our research that women are generally more interested than men. Millennials, those aged 30 to 44, tend to be most interested when we look at age cohorts. People that are of higher income, that's defined as over $100,000 in income, are more interested. We find Hispanics are the most interested among racial and ethnic groups. And we also find that people who are married or who have children in the household tend to be more interested than those that don't. Um, Looking again at comparing the people who are most interested in a weight loss medication versus those who aren't, everybody agrees that obesity is a major health problem in the United States, but the people who are interested are actually much more aware that there are medications that can treat obesity, and they're also more likely to believe that obesity is a disease and not just a failure of willpower or not willing to exercise. So there is an understanding there among those who are interested in these medications that obesity is something that people need help to overcome. So that said, there's all this interest among consumers for weight loss medications. Why isn't everyone rushing right out to get it? I'd like to just sort of take a step back and look at the economic factors here. Um, in general, there is a negative perception of the US economy, which really we believe could create a drag on usage of AOMs by consumers. Just over half of Americans believe that they are struggling or just getting by. We have 42% who believe inflation will be here for at least another year. We know that data might show that inflation is really back to a normal level, but the general level of prices right now is a lot higher than it was a few years ago. And lastly, 71% of Americans expect the cost of their groceries and food shopping to increase over the next 6 months. So there's definitely this general sense among the public that things are getting tight. And when we look at the people who are most interested in weight loss medications, they're actually much more inclined to be focused on these economic situations. They're much more interested in saving than spending. So a majority of the folks who are interested in weight loss medications, they're spending more on food to cook at home and less on eating out. They're more likely to be saving for a safety net for the future. They're more likely to be saving to treat themselves in the future rather than right now. They're also the ones that are more likely to be holding off on purchases, whether that's a big ticket item like a home or a car, or something as simple as a vacation. The last item on this slide, the postponing or skipping medical treatment, even though it's just 26% of those who are interested in a weight loss medication that have done that, that suggests that even though they might believe obesity is a disease, they might not be willing to spend high out-of-pocket costs to get a medication for it, especially if they have other comorbidities that they need to treat. So with that said, I will turn it over to my colleague Roberto to talk about HCP attitudes towards AOMs.
Thank you, Scott, and very interesting perspectives from consumers. And I have to say that our data among healthcare professionals chime with some of the considerations you just provided, and also they provide a complementary lens to understand this landscape. And in the next few slides, I'm going to show some insights from our obesity and cardiometabolic therapy monitor. And just to give you a bit of background to better understand the data, this is a study that we run quarterly across several markets amongst HCPs, and it has essentially two components. First, we ask physicians about their perceptions regarding anti-obesity medications. And then we ask the same clinicians to submit real-world data on some of their patients currently managed for obesity. And we give them a very detailed patient record forms. And the data I'm going to show you now comes from the wave we conducted in the US in the period between last October to December. and involved 300 physicians who manage obesity across multiple specialties, and they submitted a total of 720 patient cases. So to talk about IOMs and HCPs, a key starting point is to acknowledge that IOMs are well established among healthcare professionals in the US, but also at the same time, they have still large room for future growth. And indeed, as you can see in this slide, HCPs in our study currently prescribe medication to around half of their obesity caseload, 52%. And this is matched by the recommendation of lifestyle interventions such as diet and exercise, for example. Other strategies like bariatric surgery definitely play a role, an important role also, but they are much less prescribed and are prescribed specifically to specific patients. And just a note here in our definition of anti-obesity medications, we've been quite broad and representative of the actual clinical practice. So within this umbrella term, we included the GLP-1 drugs indicated for weight loss, but we also included GLP-1s indicated for type 2 diabetes because we see that some clinicians do prescribe them also for weight loss. And we also included other drugs for weight loss that are not GLP-1s. So when it comes to selecting which patients to treat with IOMs, US HCPs clearly are prioritizing people with a more severe disease, especially those with a BMI of 35 and more, and with weight-related conditions that put them at risk of developing cardiometabolic disease. And this data is particularly interesting as it explains the still limited use of IOMs and also shows that the treatment criteria currently used in the clinical practice are somehow stricter than the approved labels for GLP-1s, which state instead that these drugs can be prescribed to patients with a BMI of 30 or above or a BMI of 27 plus with at least one comorbidity. And this data on this slide also is interesting as it establishes really the importance of comorbidities in driving HCP weight loss treatment decision. And we have a bit more of this data in a while. So though the use of IOMs is still somehow limited, and this is also partly due to the issues Scott was mentioning earlier around access and supply, HCPs say that they're confident in prescribing them. Here we see that 70% of US physicians are confident in proactively discussing them as a treatment option for their patients. US clinicians also recognize how interconnected the treatment of obesity and weight-related comorbidities are and see anti-obesity medication as a solution. 62% state to proactively prescribe weight loss strategies to prevent weight-related comorbidities, and 57 say that IOMs are top of mind when a patient has weight-related conditions. So now to put things a bit more in context, we can look at the answers provided by primary care physicians in the US specifically and compare them with those provided by PCPs in another important market like Germany. And US PCPs are particularly focused on comorbidities, with the majority of them indicating that they consider IOMs to both treat and prevent comorbidities, versus less than 1/3 of their German counterparts. And this is very telling of the specific mindset and the understanding of obesity as a complex disease. Now, amongst all comorbidities, we know that the link between obesity and type 2 diabetes is clear, is very well established. And this is reflected in the data here, and where ACP in the clinical practice told us that 77% of them treat both conditions, diabetes and obesity, at the same time. They may use different agents to treat them, but we have evidence that many patients are treated for both indication with the same medication, really showing that ACPs are treating these patients holistically. They don't distinguish between the two conditions. It will be very interesting to monitor how the role of other comorbidities beyond type 2 diabetes, for example, MASH, CKD, or heart failure, will grow in the future. And we expect that as GLP-1 approval extends to these additional indications, the influence of these comorbidities in influencing obesity treatment decision will increase and shape the market, offering GLP-1 players different opportunities for brand differentiation and expansion. And the market also offers companies with several other critical opportunities for growth for GLP-1s, as HCPs in our study mentioned these key unmet needs. So in particular, they would like to have more efficacy data, in particular long-term outcomes data and data for cardiovascular risk reduction. They also want to have an improved equitable access for anti-obesity medications, and this is a key issue, especially in the US. They also would like option with a better safety profile and more oral administration options. And with this, I will now leave the stage back to Scott.
Thanks, Roberto. We'll now talk about some of what we see are the near-term implications for anti-obesity medications. We really see three main buckets for how we think the impact of GLP-1s will impact the obesity space. The first is there's definitely been an uptick in adoption of these medications, but it might be slower than the hype would suggest. Certainly lack of access, and that means both access from a insurance standpoint as well as from just having product on the shelves. Both of those have really limited adoption, in our opinion. And the last item is new access points and could offer some lower pricing, could help drive adoption, but there are certainly some risks down those paths. So starting with the uptick in adoption, this is some data from Ipsos from some social listening that we've done. This is capturing public comments on platforms like the artist formerly known as Twitter, Reddit, blogs, patient forums, and other publicly available consumer-created content. And looking back to 2022 to present day, you can see that social media mentions, particularly of Ozempic, have massively grown since 2023, when we first saw semaglutide approved specifically for obesity with the Wegovy brand name. Now, it's interesting to note, Ozempic is the version of semaglutide that's indicated for type 2 diabetes, not for weight loss, but it's become kind of the catch-all term, kind of the Kleenex for the market space. So even though it's a type 2 diabetes drug, people shorthand it as Ozempic, and it's used both positively and as a slur when talking about potentially celebrities that are using it. So that's really what we see as the shorthand in consumer discourse online about GLP-1s. It's really focused on using Ozempic as the name for that. There aren't nearly as many mentions of Wegovy or Mounjaro or other newer medications in the GLP-1 class. When we look at that online buzz, it's generally neutral, although there is some negative connotations there. In particular, the negativity is attaching to Ozempic. And when we talk about characterizing these comments as positive or negative, we're using NLP and machine learning to really understand whether the comments are positive, negative, or neutral. The negative comments that we're seeing, particularly those attaching to Ozempic, has to do with stock levels, so not being able to get the product. It has to do with concerns primarily from the body positivity community, but really what kind of message do these medications send about body image and what the ideal body should look like? And then the last piece that falls in that negative category is speculation about celebrities or the misuse of the product. Again, this is where you'll say such and such celebrity looks like they were on Ozempic, or this person should go on Ozempic, things like that. So there are some negative connotations there. So despite all of that, we would characterize the usage of GLP-1s as really low relative to the need and the interest. The data on the right hand of the slide is from consumers who are telling us in the past 3 months, only 7% have taken an anti-obesity medication in the past um, 3 months, 11% saying they've asked their doctor about it. So even though we see over half of Americans saying they're interested, we're not seeing that translating into massive amounts of people. The data on the left side of the chart is from Novo Nordisk's recent quarterly earnings report showing the total weekly prescriptions for Wegovy and Zepbound, which are the obesity indications of the GLP-1s. We can see in total it's trending at around 300,000 prescriptions specific for obesity, which translates to, less than 10% of the population. So we've seen a lot of uptick, but still not as much as social media and news hype might lead you to believe. Part of the reason why we think that's being slowed down is because there are challenges with insurance, with coverage. Employer-based systems are where most Americans get their healthcare coverage, and employers are still sorting out if they want to cover these medications or not. We've certainly have seen Medicare agree to cover Wegovy only for those patients that have heart disease. But even there, it's unclear as to what that will mean for premiums for those patients in 2025 and 2026. So there's a lot still being sorted out. Physicians will tell us, and this is data coming from Roberto, that out-of-pocket costs are really their primary concern when they're recommending AOMs to their patients. And it's the main reason why people who are eligible otherwise aren't being treated. So even for doctors, they're seeing that as a challenge. And from the payer perspective, some data that's coming to us from a third party suggests that only 34% of US employers are right now providing GLP-1 coverage for both diabetes and obesity. And those who are providing that coverage are trying to really do what they can to control the costs. So they're relying on prior authorizations and different step through edits and different requirements like a BMI documentation and potentially comorbidity requirements to control costs and to limit who actually has access. And that connects nicely with what Roberto is telling us, in that HCPs are also kind of limiting the usage to those who have the comorbidities. So again, these are things that depress the uptake of AOMs. Stocking has also been a real challenge. So the GLP-1 manufacturers, and we're talking primarily about Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly, they've really struggled to keep product on the shelves. Right now, the starter dose for Wegovy is on the FDA shortage list. As of now, and I'm knocking on wood because I think this was like a week ago, all of the dosages for Ozempic, Mounjaro, and Zepbound are available, but they've spent significant time on the FDA shortage list. So what that means and what that's meant for Wegovy in particular is that Novo Nordisk, because they've had such challenges, have prioritized existing patients and not having them drop off the medication. So they prioritized the higher dosages. And so having the starter dosages be in shortage means that new prescribing, new patients are not able to start on that medication. The manufacturing challenges that they're facing, it's not just the molecule, which is a large molecule, but the device itself. So over the past 10 years, best practice in the type 2 diabetes space, which is also leading into the obesity space, is for a weekly device that's an auto injector. So these are single-use pens with a mechanism that makes it a lot easier for the patient to inject themselves. It's been very difficult making enough of those to keep on the shelves for the demand that we're seeing from patients. So that's really a challenge. I think looking at new potential formulations that will be, for anybody that has medications in pipeline, having a good sense of what kind of device is needed and a supply chain to get a device manufactured is really going to be critical. Now, there aren't any oral medications of the GLP-1 version that are specifically indicated for obesity yet. Orals in this space could be easier to manufacture, but as you saw in Oliver's presentation, the molecules are really large, and that makes it very difficult to put in a pill formulation. So, for example, Rybelsus, which is the oral formulation of semaglutide indicated for type 2, it's in phase 3 trials right now for obesity, but that's not really necessarily the best experience for patients. It needs to be dosed first thing in the morning on an empty stomach with no more than 4 ounces of water, and then 30 minutes of fasting before you can take any additional food, medication, water. So it's asking a lot of patients, especially if you think about more of an overweight or an obese patient who might not have other comorbidities or who might not be taking other medications. It's a difficult regimen to adopt to. So even the oral formulations have been difficult just due to the size of the molecules. There are also new access points that have emerged to try to fill the demand that consumers have for these medications. So we're seeing a lot of wellness spas and digital health startups offering GLP-1s, and it's oftentimes my comment of dubious provenance and quality. Like for example, there's a day spa down the street from me that offers in big banners outside semaglutide and B12 injections, which isn't really a thing. It's not clear where the semaglutide is coming from. Is it and how good it is? There have been lawsuits filed by Lilly by Novo Nordisk against compounders. There have also been plenty of adverse events, including hospitalizations for patients that have taken these kinds of compounded treatments. It's unclear if the dosage is correct. It's unclear what else is in the medication. So there's a lot of risk there, in my opinion. Um, we're also seeing more established online health platforms like Weight Watchers, Rohims, offering GLP-1s. Again, some of these might be compounded, some of these are more working with a doctor and with more established pharmacies. We're also seeing the pharma companies themselves stepping in to try to partner with online pharmacies to help deliver product to patients. So Lilly has started something called Lilly Direct, where they will help match a patient up with potentially a telehealth provider and an online pharmacy to get their product in hand. So there's a lot of new access points here because the availability has just been so challenging. So in summary, there's really strong interest by consumers in AOMs, but the cost and the availability could really limit that usage. HCPs are very positive towards AOMs and are adopting the medications, but there's really right now prioritizing people with comorbidities. And lastly, we do find that online buzz is really outpacing the actual usage, and that's because we're seeing coverage stocking as adoption barriers. Would like to leave you with a quote from the medical director of Weight Watchers, Dr. Nadolsky. This was from an article in a recent publication by Ipsos, but I think it's really interesting, and I think it kind of speaks to where he sees the future of treatment of obesity. It's not out of the realm that in the future there will be therapies that prevent obesity in the first place, similar to using statins for preventing heart disease. While weight gain may be prevented, there will likely still be a need for lifestyle to optimize health beyond the scale. So I really agree with that. I think we'll start to see much more widespread usage and adoption of AOMs. I think eventually insurance plans will need to start providing these at a fuller level than they are now. And I think we'll see a lot more widespread usage of them. But I also don't think that AOMs will negate the need for a healthy diet and exercise. So with that, that wraps up our presentation. Thank you, Roberto. And thank you everyone for your attention.